Morning, everybody. Welcome to our breakout session, a return to defined benefit pension plans, ? And thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I want to share a few housekeeping remarks. The news media may be in attendance and may cite speaker and audience comments. Comments made by myself or the other speakers are our own and don't necessarily reflect the views of the American Academy of Actuaries or its committees, the Actuarial Standards Board, the Actuarial Board for Counseling and Discipline, or our employers.
And because I am government, I really must make the disclaimer that the views are my own. They don't represent the Office of the Advocate or PBGC. I am happy to connect you with PBGC's Public Affairs Office, I must give that disclaimer. So
thank you, Camille.
I think that was strong enough.
I think that's the best government disclaimer I've heard in a while.
The Academy believes in good faith that this session offers 1.2 organized activity continuing education credits under the U.S. qualification standards, and the Academy operates in compliance with the requirements of applicable law, including federal antitrust laws. So I want to introduce our presenters today, and I'm really excited to have this panel here. We had a fantastic planning call, and when we were done, I said we should have just said, enter this. It was wonderful, and go from there. So I'm hoping we can have the same invigorating discussion. Folks have strong opinions, and we're looking forward to a great conversation. So I'm Linda Stone, the Senior Retirement Fellow at the American Academy of Actuaries. I've been in this role for about 5 years after a career consulting mainly with large employers in the private plan space. And my role at the Academy really is to be the bridge between the work that the Academy and the volunteers do to our external stakeholders, including folks on the Hill in the agencies and other stakeholders to share the work that we do. So our first speaker is Camille Castro, who's the Senior Associate Participant and Plan Sponsor Advocate in the Office of the Advocate at the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation. In this role, she helps participants and plan sponsors resolve issues and disputes with the PBGC. She also assists participants who are looking for information about their lost pension plans, and I'm sure that is sometimes very difficult to do. Camille received a BA in economics from Boston College, a JD from Syracuse University College of Law, and an LLM in taxation with a certificate in employee benefits law from Georgetown University Law Center. Chantel Sheeks is Vice President of Retirement Policy at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. She develops, promotes, and publicizes the Chamber's policy on retirement plans, non-qualified deferred compensation, and Social Security. In addition, Chantel regularly meets with members of Congress, the administration, and regulatory agencies to advocate the Chamber's retirement policy. Chantel has 27 years of experience in employee benefits law, including both policy and practice. She was also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law for 17 years. Chantel has a BA in Spanish and Russian, so feel free to sprinkle that in, from Randolph-Macon Women's College, and a JD from Northeastern University School of Law. And Tim Geddes is Vice President, Professionalism and Education for the American Academy of Actuaries, serving a 2-year term that runs through November 2024. In his day job, Tim leads Deloitte's U.S. retirement actuarial business, serving many of its largest retirement actuarial clients, and has more than 20 years of professional experience helping companies design, value, and govern their retirement plans. Tim previously served as the Academy's Vice President Pension and served as an Academy Regular Director. So before we get started in the conversation, I wanted to just put in perspective where are DB plans now, since we're talking about that question mark. So here's some context-setting information, and there was a great report that the Congressional Research Service put out in September 2024. And they do great work, and this really tells a story. The one line that I think people see in the headlines a lot is half of people in this country don't participate in any retirement plan. And you can see that up top. The solid line is really access to a plan. The dotted lines are participation in plans. So basically, you can see that gap between people who have access to a plan and don't participate in it. With DC auto enrollment becoming more popular, I would expect to see those lines, maybe closing over time. But what we're here to talk about today is the orange line at the bottom, where you can see that DB access has declined from 22% to 15%. And participation currently is about 11%. So you may ask, if somebody has access to a plan, a DB plan, why aren't they participating? Basically, it's the age and service requirements for people to actually get in a plan. There may be a few stray plans out there still with employee contributions based on the data, but some of us last night couldn't really think of many there. So it's probably mostly the age service requirements. If you go underneath the numbers, often, as you know, there's some really interesting stories there and disparities. So if we look at the fact that only 11% of all private sector workers, and again, we know folks in the public plans sponsored by state and local governments have higher numbers than those participation numbers, but here we're looking at all private sector workers. So if we think about overall, that's 11% of workers are participating in a DB plan. If we go underneath that, we see that the numbers vary greatly in different groups. So union members, 66% participate. Where non-union members, it's 10%. The lowest 25% of wage earners, only 4% of them participate in a defined benefit plan. Where the highest 25% of wage earners, 29% of them participate. If we look at small employers, less than 50, only 5% of them participate. Where organizations with over 500 employees, 38% of them participate in a defined benefit plan. And if we look at type of work, management and professional workers, 20% of them have access to a DB plan. If you're in the service industry, it's only 5%. So you really can see the disparities in the groups underneath that one number. So I wanted to just highlight that. This recently was released from ICI, and I thought, again, every picture tells a story. And the story here, if you look at that brown private sector DB plans, you can see where that is not only where we started in 2000. So you look at DB at that point was 2. DC plans were 3. And again, this is trillion. This is a good trivia question. Next time you're with friends, how many, what's the value of retirement assets in this country? $40 trillion. So what's interesting, again, you look at that 2 for defined benefit plans, has grown to 3.2 today. The DC plans, you can see that getting bigger all the way across. And I think the other story when you look at today is what's happening with IRAs. And there is some concern that IRAs are growing because of rollovers from qualified plans, whether defined benefit or defined contribution, and some of the qualified plan protections that get lost when participants exit those plans, whether through termination or employers are offering things like lump sum offers where they're leaving those plans, they're putting those assets into IRAs. And we just, Chantel had a fantastic conference yesterday at the Chamber, and I heard one statistic that many of those dollars that get rolled over into an IRA from a plan, they can sit in cash for up to 7 years. I think it was like 30%. So it's that people just don't, they may be in a fantastic target date fund, and then, they roll the money over, it sits there in cash. And, that's an issue for retirement security. Certainly. So these next couple slides are from our pension committee's ERISA 50 Years of Shaping the Single Employer DB Landscape. So you can look for that on actuary.org. I, of course, have my paper copy here. I'll wave around. So these graphs are there if you want to see a little more of the substance behind them and some of the stories. But again, what we're looking at here is really the growth trajectory or lack thereof, right? You can see what's happening to DC plans. You can see the decline of DB plan. This is the number of plans, and this information is from the DOL. So you can see that over time. And then the next graph is really looking at the percent of active participants as a percent of private sector workers. And again, you can just see that tremendous decline over time. And when you think about 1980s, I mean, there is a sense of things were rosier, you know, back in the day. Everybody had a DB plan. I can see Chantel shaking her head, and we're going to look forward to hearing that. But, you know, as a practitioner, you know, working on defined benefit plans, you did get a sense of, well, of course everybody has these, because you had lots of companies that you were working on, and you didn't have a sense of some of the populations that we already talked about who don't have access to these plans. And then where actually you see some growth, if you look at the numbers from the PBGC, you see growth in really small plans. And if, again, unless you dig in, it looks like, oh, DB plans are growing. But go a little further, it's these small plans. And many of you know these small plans really are for kind of owner businesses. They're a tax shelter, in a sense, a tax planning policy. So these may not, again, be the type of plans that people think of as these are fantastic, because a lot of these plans just terminate when the owner gets their benefit and it's time to retire. But that is a place where there is some growth in the system. So I just wanted to kind of point out kind of where we were as we start our discussion. So the description for this session, and I have to thank Tanya Manning. She's not here. Unfortunately, she had to catch a plane, but she was really helpful in the planning process for this webinar. And one of the focus was really talking about, well, what did IBM do, and is that a way forward? Is that something that other companies can do? And again, once you look at IBM's situation, you have some insights into the answer to that question. The other thing that's been really interesting lately is the unions who, in their negotiations, have been bargaining, we want a defined benefit plan. So it first happened at UAW, got a lot of headlines. UAW in 2007 was their cutoff. You had to be hired before that to get in the DB plan. After that, no. So those workers wanted the DB plan back. They didn't get it. I mean, they got pretty hefty employer contributions to the 401k plan, but they didn't get the DB plan. Boeing is the one that's been in the headlines recently, and they as well want that defined benefit plan back, and they have not been successful. They turned down the latest offer with a very high level of pay increase, more in the 401k, but they're kind of holding the line, we want our defined benefit plan back. So I wanted to start the discussion just with Tim to give us some sense of, you know, is the IBM reopening the plan? What does that really mean as we look out at the plan sponsor universe?
Yeah, hopefully this is working, Linda. I mean, I think everybody in this room has probably thought and looked at why IBM did what they did. I think I don't have any inside information, but from the outside, I think the biggest thing you need to think about in considering why they might have made that choice is the fact that they were overfunded at the end of 2023 by $4.5 billion in a plan that had no accruals. The service cost they disclosed for 2023 was $0. So they were faced with a plan. They had executed an annuity purchase the year prior for $16 billion. So they'd already taken a lot of risk off by annuitizing retirees. I think many people in this room have been in the business long enough to remember that IBM was one of the pioneers of cash balance plans. So we know that a lot of that liability that is in there is probably cash balance liability. For those of you who have worked a lot on plan terminations, cash balance liabilities are very expensive to terminate. And so if you put all those facts together, they're sitting on a plan that's overfunded by $4 billion, is only going to grow more overfunded. They'd already de-risked their investments. They're more than 75% fixed income. And you're faced with, well, what am I going to do with that money? And with that decision, I think the leaders there probably looked at the true economics of it and said, we're going to provide accruals until some of this surplus is gone, because otherwise it's just going to sit there as a ineffective asset on our balance sheet. I think it's clearly better for defined benefit plans that they made that decision, but I don't think it portends a substantial growth in other companies' appetite for defined benefit plans. I think the second topic, Linda, about the unions, I personally think that is more interesting and shows more promise for the potential resurgence of defined benefit plans. I think in the 2000s and earlier in the 2010s, maybe, there was a capitulation, I think, by the unions to say, look, our people need pay raises, things are tough, we're willing to let you freeze the plan, just give us something, keep it going for the existing members if you can, but we're willing to give up on something that we thought was pretty important to the labor movement, right? Pensions were a big part of what the labor movement wanted early on. I think seeing that sort of change and transition, I think that's important, because if workers are willing to fight for something like a defined benefit plan, I think there's an opportunity that you could manage those costs well, and it could be a bargaining chip from the other side to agree to that. It hasn't happened yet. We'll see if Boeing gets what they want. The UAW didn't, like you said, Linda, but I think that's more encouraging for the potential sort of resurrection of the defined benefit plan.
Yeah, Chantel, you're in a unique role at the Chamber with having that direct line to employers. So just curious about how all this
They're not going to open them up.
was looked at.
I mean, it's been interesting, especially when you look at some of the negotiations of how high they're willing to go on the defined contribution side of it. Some of the negotiations up to 14%, and it makes you kind of question. You're like, well, if you're putting 14% of compensation, I'm no actuary, I'm just a lawyer, that money you could feasibly spend in a defined benefit plan. But for so many other reasons, especially coming down from, you have your CFO, you have everybody else looking at this, and they're not willing to take on that long-term risk. And there's the big ideas. Everyone's like, well, it's just this. No, it's already, they are, for example, Boeing pays the highest amount of PBGC premiums of anyone already. So to then
in dollar
amounts, I believe they're up at about $500 million per year. Just that. So to go to say to the CFO, hey, here's a great idea. We're going to reopen this, and we're going to pay even more money to the PBGC. And I just don't see this as a starter for them. And it's also it'll be interesting to see is right now you look at some of the workforces, you look at like UAW and Boeing, they all have a much older workforce. But with some of the other industries we're looking at, they have a much younger workforce and more transient workforce that doesn't necessarily even want these. So I think you also have to look at the demographic of who's asking for it.
Yeah, you mentioned the state of the current workforce, and is this something they even want? And, we were talking about some of the myths about, workforce tenure, that like back in the day, everybody was getting DB benefits. Forget the fact that average tenure back then was 5 years, close to what it is now. And there were vesting schedules where you had to, be there 15 years for a full benefit. So, the current workforce, is this what they want? We've got the gig economy going on. So we wanted to talk about first, from an employee perspective, is, put the unions aside. And I think that really is an interesting story, and especially that split I showed you, that the, union members were the ones mostly still in these plans. And let's talk about from an employee perspective, is there any desire for a DB plan versus their defined contribution plan? So I thought we'd ask Camille to give us some perspectives.
Yeah, and again, is it working now? All right, here we go. And I'm glad that we're dispelling this myth that it was this wonderful world where everybody had DB. I personally don't know anyone that has a DB unless they're in government. And you have a DB. Okay, so here we go. All right, we have people raising our hands. But I think for the younger generation, they were just, DB was not on the table. By the time they entered the workforce, these plans had been frozen or closed, or it was just entirely, DC. And workers, they do value the portability and flexibility that you get with the defined contribution. And with the defined benefit plan, that really benefits people that stay with an employer for a long period. Linda had sent around a new Vanguard study that's focused on DC
FDC, but it did say that most employees change jobs like at least 9 times during their career. So you have people that even if they are accruing a benefit, it's very small. And so you have these kind of small annuities that really don't add up to much. And then of course you have the people that just leave before they're vested, where, you know, I have to be a champion of DB because I work at PBGC. And I think, you know, a lot of people, they're, first of all, they're not familiar with PBGC. It's not like the FDIC where we have commercials, you know, but I think of course, you know, a lot more people have bank accounts than they do pension plans, but, you know, they forget that DB is a way to have that lifetime income, you know, besides Social Security, and also just the spousal and survivor protections that DB offers. You know, a lot of people just aren't aware of that, but I think now, especially with the mobile workforce and also with competing priorities, you know, people have student loans, there's housing costs. I mean, life is expensive, and so a lot of people will forego, you know, putting money into a DC, and again, that's where DB is attractive. When it's part of your compensation package, you don't need to think about it, it's there. And so I think maybe if workers knew more about DB, they would want it, but unfortunately, I don't think people are really clamoring about it. And I hate to say that because I work for PBGC, and that's really not a message that I want. It's just, but it's the reality.
Yeah, I just want to ask Chantel, we heard yesterday that in looking at DC plans, one of the record keepers saw absolutely no handcuffs for people hanging on for that cliff vesting. You know, you would expect to see, if that mattered, that people would stay until they vested, and then you'd see the turnover kind of spike after. You know, that's not happening. That was really interesting to me, because on the defined benefit side, you know, you have some of the same issues, especially with cash balance plans, and, you know, some of the same issues with people taking lump sums from those plans, and what happens to that money, and this concept that that time of termination, how many terminations from employment somebody has, is really risky.
Yeah, and I think that the thing that we really are talking about is, what do you want your plan to do? And what's the purpose of having the plan? Is that, you know, we always would hear the employer saying, well, I'm going to do this because it's retention. Well, first of all, if you have an employee who wants to leave, do you really want them to stay? I mean, the answer is no, you don't. But we did discuss of turning it around. And that's where I think, depending on if we can come up with new plan designs that actually focus on a mobile workforce, that are portable and easy to explain to people, you can actually use them as a retention tool. Stop thinking about this as a recruitment tool, because first of all, nobody understands what vesting is, like, other than us. Is like, my boyfriend didn't even know what an actuary was. So, and he said it was fake news that I was going to this today. So, so I am going to, he's German, okay? So I'm actually going to give him
Was that one of your languages, or you now have picked that up?
I actually have my German class tonight, so I'm picking that one up. But that's where we need to really get it, is because we saw the data, and if anybody wants this, I can ask Vanguard. I'm happy to give it to you. But it really did show people are leaving. So we put all this work, we put all this effort into doing all this, and they don't understand it. And I think it's also important on the DC side, and I think this goes to, if we really want a resurgence of the DB, we have to be simple and explain it. 40% of people thought they were enrolled in a plan, and they weren't after they changed jobs, because they had been automatically enrolled at their prior employer. They went to a new employer, they weren't automatically enrolled, and they're like, oh, I'm enrolled. So we can create a DB plan, but it has to be explained. It has to be explained that it's part of your compensation, and it has to be portable. And without any of those, I just can't see employees they don't even value what they have already, and then add some other layer on to say, you're going to get this benefit. You're 25 years old right now, and you're going to get a benefit if you stay with us for the next 40 years, and it'll be great. It's hard to sell.
Tim?
First, I'm going to defend your boyfriend, because I don't know if anybody's ever seen, the word in German for actuary is the word for insurance, the word for company, and the word for mathematician, all smashed together. It's the word itself is like 30 letters long. So maybe that's why he doesn't know.
They have limited. It's now actuar.
Oh, they've come up with a new
They've come up.
Very good. So it's funny. I thank you, Linda, for giving me the opportunity to be on a panel where I'm the optimist. I don't think that's ever happened to me ever before. I actually see just in day-to-day conversations with people 20 years ago, I think no employees really wanted a DB plan. They didn't know if they were in one. I think maybe they took for granted that maybe if they stayed their whole career, they'd have a pension or something. They get something, right? They'll take care of me in some way. But there didn't really seem to be any attention paid whatsoever. I feel like that has at least swung a little bit in that I do think now workers, maybe older workers, they appreciate the idea if there is a pension. I've had a couple people say, "Oh, I interviewed with this job. They still have a pension." Like that's, and they don't know how much it's worth, but it was something, right? It was something more than zero that was appealing to them. I think I'm going to take the other side of what Chantel was saying about portability. To me, where I see defined benefit like benefits being truly effective as a retention tool is on some of the non-qualified plans where we still have very long handcuffs and you have to stay for a very long period of time or reach retirement age to really get much of anything. And you see people behaving in that way. You see very little turnover amongst the people who are eligible for those benefits because they know they got to stay until they're 55 to get them. So I actually wonder if you restructured it where you had longer vesting tiers, if it could be more effective and then maybe cost less and maybe be appealing to both groups. I certainly recognize people are changing jobs a lot. I certainly recognize that it's hard if you were in a DB system and you kept leaving before you were vested or you kept leaving with small benefits, you're really not getting much. But usually the solution to make something portable is to allow people to take lump sums and roll it over somewhere else. And then I would wonder, well, is that really helping anybody if all we're doing is coming up with a new formula to give you some money you can invest in maybe in cash?
Yeah, so from an employer perspective, somebody mentioned this really at one time was thought to be defined benefit plans, attracting and retaining employees, really using them as a workforce management tool. Do they deliver that value? And I think, Tim, you had some good perspectives on, what a CFO might feel versus the CHRO there. And I think the other interesting conversation around looking at this from an employer perspective is this, the current model is benefits are based on your employment. That's kind of changing with some of the state IRA programs that are now mandatory in certain states where, it is because you're employed, but you're not necessarily tied to a plan of that specific employer. So I'm wondering if you want to comment on those two things.
I'll contradict what I said earlier about optimism, and I'll say I do agree with Chantel. After the IBM announcement, we sort of got on the phones and talked to a number of our biggest clients across the firm about what happened because people were interested. Like, why did they do this? More than a couple CFOs started the call with me with, we're not going to reopen the defined benefit plan. And it's fascinating. One of them, I won't tell you who they are, but one of them has a plan that's even more overfunded than the IBM plan. It has no clear use for this amazing amount of surplus that they're building. And yet the meeting was over. In all intents and purposes, he was polite and let me talk for a while. But the meeting was over in 2 minutes. He basically said, we're not going to do this. I think that's a challenge to us as the actuaries to try to explain to people that, I'm old, and so I remember the commercial that it's not your father's Oldsmobile. Nobody even knows what an Oldsmobile is anymore. The plans don't have to be the way that they were 25, 30 years ago, right? We can help the CFO manage the plan in a way that substantially reduces the risk of sponsoring that plan. I think we maybe need to work harder to change the narrative about what could you do. If you're willing to give 14% of pay, you could certainly give a very low risk pension benefit that might, for less than that, to make the union workers happy with what you're offering them. I think maybe we need to get that word out a little bit more, that it doesn't have to be the way that it was. It could be something that meets in the middle somewhere.
I mean, I think that's the good point, is that DB plans, they need a new marketing person for them. Is because so many of the times and our employers, it's probably the member that I'm thinking about. I have some members who are 150% funded. It's a closed plan. They've done great investments. And instead of just reopening the plan, they're like, Chantel, you need to go up to Congress and let us have different uses of that money. I'm like, or you could reopen it. Nope. They think that there's a better chance of me changing the law than reopening the plan. So I think that tells you
You're a very
something.
powerful woman.
Have you seen Congress lately? That the last one yesterday when we had on our panels, we're like, what's your wish list for things you could do to make the pension system, retirement system better? And the first one was a functioning Congress. And I was like, well, that's really a big wish list. So, but that just gives you an idea of where people are. But I do like that. What I think what we need to do is change the narrative of what a DB is, what it can be, because so many of my members are just like, I can't deal with that cost. I can't deal with the uncertainty of what's going to go up. And I also, if I'm a public company, I don't want to have to report that on my 10K. So you put all of that together, and they've gotten a bad rap. And until we kind of change, they just needed a good makeover.
Well, it's interesting you said that, because the Academy did a lot of work to celebrate ERISA at 50. And so we delved a bit into the history. And one of the things I learned that was really interesting was, back in the early 70s, it really did seem like ERISA was not going to happen. There was a split between, who really wanted it to happen, unions versus multi-employer plans. So, the proponents of ERISA took it upon themselves to hold congressional hearings to try to get the public more involved. And I joke that this was like social media 1970s style, to have these hearings. But, they had people come and tell the horror stories of what happened to them at Studebaker. They lost their pension. So they got this groundswell of, yes, we really want this law to happen, that actually helped push it over the finish line. So it was really interesting, because you feel like now with this conversation kind of happening, on the union side of things, is there a little window here for that makeover? So before we get too far along with the rest of this discussion, I do want to bring in the PBGC, because you can't have any conversation about the future of defined benefit plans and, what could happen, how plan sponsors are looking at this, without talking more about the PBGC. And the PBGC has 3 goals. First is to encourage the continuation of the plans. The second is to provide for, timely and uninterrupted payment of the benefits that get transferred to them. And the third is to maintain premiums at the lowest level consistent with carrying out its obligations. And I know the actuaries in the room know that, there is quite a large surplus now in the single employer side of the PBGC. So it really takes the opportunity to look at, it is time to examine the PBGC's role in what has been happening to define benefit plans, not only, those that have terminated, but those who are increasingly, closing the plans and transferring benefits to insurance companies to avoid these premiums. So I just wanted to ask Camille, you certainly have a unique insight into this in your plan advocate role, to talk about the mission of the PBGC, and maybe to talk a little bit more, to the extent you can, share about the roundtables that you've had in that office and what you're going to be reporting out. Because I think, it's not just about the numbers and the premiums. It really is looking at, can PBGC be doing maybe some things differently than it has to try to fulfill that mission going forward?
Yeah, and I think they've done a great job at the second prong of the mission and providing, payments, uninterrupted payments to participants. But the first and the third, they need a lot of work. So in the Office of the Advocate, we were created in MAP 21, and we essentially act as a liaison between participants, plan sponsors, and the agency. We also help these parties resolve disputes with PBGC. So just a little advertisement. If you need any help, please contact me. But in 2017, back when premiums, the flat rate was only $69 a person, and I think the cap was 517, we did a de-risking study at the request of the plan sponsor community to look at actions that PBGC could take to kind of perhaps slow de-risking and also congressional actions. And of course, the number one thing that came out of that was, the premiums are too high, they need to be lowered. And so as a follow-up, a few years later, our office launched our Retirement Security Initiative. And with help from Bolton Consulting, with Ellen Kleinstuber as a fantastic moderator, we held a series of 6 roundtables. We had participant, plan sponsor, advocacy groups, economists, actuaries, service providers, and we were really looking at retirement security through the lens of the PBGC mission and, what can the agency be doing to promote the continuation and maintenance of the defined benefit system. And of course, it's tied to the third prong of the mission, which are PBGC premiums. And the crazy thing is that the agency has a part of a mission that it is essentially not in control of. Premiums are set by Congress, and ever since 1980, the premiums have been included in the general revenue for budget scoring purposes, even though the premiums can only be used to pay for PBGC programs. So you have a situation where we have these premiums that are going up and up and up, 101 this year for the flat rate, 686 for the cap. Next year they're just going to keep going higher. We have a $44.6 billion surplus in our single employer fund. So I'll say, premiums were a large part of the discussion, but, in reality, these premiums are set by Congress, so there's very little that PBGC could do other than kind of going up to the Hill and knocking on doors and saying, look, we have employers leaving the system, this is kind of the number one thing that they're citing, and something must be done. But another thing that came out of those roundtables was kind of what we're talking about, the rebranding and educational aspect. I mean, I love fashion, and I never thought I would see the day when everyone is wearing wide-leg jeans again. But, those are not
I'm with you there.
Yeah, I like them, but, they're not the wide leg of the 90s. You made tweaks to the fabric to kind of where they fall on the waistline. So, I think PBGC is in a great position to be that cheerleader to help with the rebranding, to, do education, what is DB, really show the benefits. And so that's kind of what we're largely focusing on coming out of these roundtables is how can the Office of the Advocate partner with PBGC to do that rebranding, to get your employers, interested again. But I think, ultimately there is that barrier of the premiums. And I know, Chantel, you go on the Hill and have these conversations, and I don't know if there's much of an appetite to take them off budget. I know over the years, there's been legislation introduced to take them from on budget to off budget, but and it's had wide support, but they really haven't gone anywhere. So.
Yeah, I mean, that's always the interesting thing is that we've been talking to the committees of jurisdiction, and when we talk to them, both on the D's and the R's, there's really a lot of support. They get it, and then they're like, yeah, but you need to go talk to budget. And as soon as we go talk to budget, they're like, no. But you do realize that this is just a gimmick. And so part of what we are trying to do is expose the fact that it is a gimmick. It is a budget gimmick, and it is hurting the American people. And especially when you start saying that. And then, but the problem then we run into we had one proposal we were looking at that I think probably most of you in the room would have supported. But they're like, well, now you got to go find someplace to pay for it. I'm like, fake news. Like, this is not, I can't go pay for it someplace else that will be real money, because what they then expect us to do is to go within the retirement system to pay for something that is a gimmick, and we're not in a position, and I don't think anyone in the room would want us to do that, of, now we're going to Rothify everything. Well, because that seems like that's everybody's solution to pay for anything, is you just Rothify the world. And it was funny that I use that as verb. It's a kind of strange world we live in. But, and that's really what we're running up against too, because we have some really, really good proposals out there. But what I think the PBGC can do, instead of talking, and this is what we're going to do as well, because I usually just talk to the pension people because that's what I do. I now need to go and talk to the budget people. and a need to explain that what they don't understand, and I've heard people say this, like, it's only $1. I'm like, yeah, you're right. And there are so many pension plans that have one person in them. Of course, it's $1, but when you have 50,000, 100,000, they don't understand how big these plans are and the number of participants it affects. So we are actually putting together some talking points. But do you know how difficult it is to go to a budget person and try to explain how a pension plan works? It's not easy. So I know some of you in here, and I may actually call on you to come up to the Hill and help me out.
Yeah, thanks, Chantel. Just one comment there. We also have seen that bipartisan agreement, which, as an American, it's always nice to see the sides coming together and agreeing that these PBGC premiums are a problem for maintaining the defined benefit coverage that I think people view as very positive. And so, we have at the Academy put an issue brief together with some PBGC reform options, but I think it is that roadblock, and we're learning more about that whole issue as well, and understand that ask of where's the money going to come from, because it is such a roadblock and it's out of the control of those committees who want to see something happen. And someone made a comment yesterday that I thought was really interesting about planned surplus, and kind of indicated maybe that could be a pay for in some way. And I was noodling over that after I left the meeting, like, oh, I wonder what that could actually mean. And we're going to be talking a little later about some regulatory other changes that could perhaps support the system. But before we move on, and then I think I'm going to take some questions, Tim, I just wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit about how you look at the PBGC premium issue and possible reforms.
Yeah, I mean, I think many of you were involved or have at least seen the Academy wrote an issue brief on PBGC premiums. There's some really good ideas in there. I mean, I think, not surprising to anyone, it starts off with removing premiums from the budget scoring. I think we can all agree with that. We just can't get it done. Although I do like the idea of, since that's a gimmick, can we just reduce minimum required contributions, which is also a gimmick to raise money? We could do that, and then maybe that'll pay for it. I'm kidding to some degree, of course. I think giving PBGC control over its own premium setting would probably be maybe a step in the right direction, or at least taking it away from Congress, which is probably not the right place to have that done. And there were some interesting ideas in the paper about how Congress could just cede the ability to set the premiums, not necessarily give up the authority. I think some of the tangible ideas that were in the paper, lowering the fixed rate premium, right? In the U.S. system, 40% of premiums in the private sector, PBGC, come from fixed rate premiums. We're just charging everybody a blanket fee regardless of the risk that they pose. In the UK, that's 10% for their system, right? So maybe the mix of fixed versus risk-based is off. You could have lower premiums for retired participants. Retired participants are less risky. Priority categories allocate assets first to retired participants. So potentially you could have a lower premium for retired participants. It's been discussed many times. It's probably hard to actually do, but you could actually try to look at the risk that the company poses from a credit perspective as part of the risk premium, right? Right now we just assume an underfunded plan is the same, whether it's sponsored by Berkshire Hathaway or whether it's sponsored by a triple C credit. We charge them the same risk premium. That probably doesn't seem right. You could consider something about the way the assets are invested, like we do for insurance, where there's a risk score applied to your assets, and you have to have a higher funded status if you have riskier assets. You could look at something like that and set the risk premium that way. And then you could consider, is there a way where risk-sharing designs that pass some of the risk away from the employer, whether those could have lower premiums. So those are some of the ideas of the paper. Overall, I think there's a lot of work that could be done to try and achieve that objective of setting premiums at the lowest possible rate to make the system sustainable.
Thanks, Tim. And I just want to take a break here. We will be looping back to talking about some possible legislative changes and some other issues, but I wanted to give anyone in the audience a chance to ask a question or share a comment from your perspective. I know you're all experts, in this space, and interested in your perspectives as well on what you've heard or what you'd like to hear from the panelists.
Yeah, thank you guys so much. It's really interesting. I had a quick addendum slash question to what you guys talked about. You said maybe workers don't understand these things. I agree, but I also think, especially for workers under 45 with no experience the law, where it's really anybody having an argument with the government, it's not just they don't understand. I think they just don't trust big business or big government or anything to really actually take care of them like their parents, employers, etc. did. So what do you guys think can be done to really improve that trust? Because I don't think it's not that they don't know, it's that they don't care to know. They don't.
And I actually,
Yeah, so I just have to briefly summarize the question for so basically the question is talking about people under 45 and their lack of trust in their employers and government, probably lack of trust that they're going to get Social Security benefits. We'll be talking about that later. So, how is that a stumbling block that can be overcome?
So I think this can be a joint effort with the agencies and the employers. Just giving a quick anecdote, I had a friend of mine who knows what I do for a living, didn't want to contribute to his 401k plan. He was like, I don't want to give money to my employer. I'm like, oh, for the love of God. People don't understand that the money is in trust. And it's not the employer's money. And I think we do need an educational campaign from the employers. And honestly, DOL, IRS, and this is part of the thing is IRS has some amazing information on it. But like I say, with small employers, how many small employers are really going to go to the IRS and be like, hey, that's the first place I'm going to look for information? So even though they have some of the best information. So we have been, and talking to DOL and PBGC, how do we come together for an educational campaign? But I will say employers are nervous that, they have to be very careful with what education they give, how they give it. They're afraid of lawsuits. There have been so many lawsuits on the defined contribution side, and now we have it on the defined benefit side, the whole mortality table lawsuits of you use the wrong mortality table, now it's a breach of fiduciary duty, it even is a settler function. Don't get me started. But I think it starts with very basic education that an employer could just say, this isn't my money, it's yours. And that's what I think so many people do not understand, and we need to do a better job of that one.
And I think also, you look at defined benefit plans, and you're right, it's kind of just like a black hole, and maybe you don't trust the employee. So, employer, in addition to kind of, PBGC doing its own public outreach campaign, we have, and I know we're going to talk about this later, look at other plan designs that may, like you have a cash balance plan where you can actually see your balance. So that may be comforting to people who are used to having like an account balance and defined contribution plans. But, with that, you do have the DB protections. So I think you can also kind of fix that distrust through plan design and making things easy and kind of what people are used to. But I agree, there's a lot of distrust. And even with PBGC, when we locate missing participants, people do not believe that the letter is real. They think, oh my, and I think now with the rise of scams, it's going to get even harder because AI and, scams are so sophisticated. So, I understand that distrust.
Thanks. Pete?
So, believe it or not, my wife, who works about 10 feet away from me, is a big TikToker. There's a movement on TikTok of younger actuaries explaining actuarial topics, such that she doesn't even know what I do. She said, "Oh, look at this retirement plan. Listen," and she listened to like a 10-part series about how pensions work, how they're funded. It was bite-sized pieces. There's a movement that is there, and I think what's missing is that
Yeah, fantastic. And I just want to make sure our listeners are going to understand that they need to go to TikTok. There's a lot of younger influencer actuaries out there talking about defined benefit plans. So check it out and maybe join the discussion. So thanks for sharing that. Any other? Yes.
I like the rebranding idea. I really love that. It's just a question or reaction on the idea of whether employer-sponsored trusts are maybe the right financial intermediary. Like, what would happen if we had a different way of financial intermediary providing a defined benefit plan? All employers have to do basically all employees have to do.
So the question really is about, is the current method of having the employer, the plan, have a trust the way to go going forward, or is there a different way that might overcome some of these other obstacles by having an intermediary kind of be the holder of those assets that the employer just contributes to? And in a way, that sounds a lot like the state IRA plans that are going on now. But anybody have a comment on that?
I was just going to say, I mean, I think that's an interesting idea. I think that's something that would remove it from the concern of I don't trust my employer. I think there's some work going on around what form could that take, right? If we want, and we're probably not, I think we're going to run out of time before we get to this section, so I'm just going to share. To me, we talk a lot about defined benefit plans, but to me, the thing that is the best about the defined benefit plan as we think of it is the risk pooling in retirement that pays the people who live a long time more and doesn't pay the people who don't live a long time as much, and it redistributes to support retirement. I think that is the key feature. And I think if you want to use a different intermediary where no one is underwriting the risk of people outliving the expectations that you're setting, you need a design that would enable that risk sharing amongst that pool. And you need something that prevents severe anti-selection against that pool. And I think those would be two critical problems that would have to be solved if you were going to take it away from the employer providing that backstop, which is then subsequently backstopped by the PBGC.
Well, I mean, I think, and there's somebody in the room I've worked with a lot on this, is the multi-employer plans and concept are great. Like the concept, especially for small employers, to say, oh, I only have to pay X amount of money per year or per whatever it is. Yeah, I agree with it. And I'm done. And then this other group over here does the payout. So the concept was great. I've had to work a lot on the concept not really working so well. So how do we take that idea, which I think that's what you're talking about, is here's this entity over here who will figure all this out. The employer will always be in there because the employer has to move the money. We can't get the employer out of it. But I know a lot of my employers, especially medium to small size, if they could say, I can provide you X, this is what you'll get. And also when you move, it can go with you. So we're solving the portability, which was all about the multi-employer plans, is that portability part of it. I think it's very attractive to employers because they actually really don't want to run a pension plan. What they really want to do is run their business. So I am completely supportive of that. They still have premiums.
I was going to say, you want to say a little bit about defined benefit PEPs, Chantel, since.
I mean, I think this is something that we really want to look into. We've seen it working in Canada, but we have to go with what you're saying is how do we do the underwriting? We have to learn from our mistakes that we had in multi-employer plans. And the good thing about that is, but we also have to look at mistakes that we even have in association retirement plans and the limitations, because right now we are still so stuck on the concept that the employer has to be the center of everything. And even with the association retirement plans that came out during the Trump administration, they still didn't want to go far enough of that you still need to have some kind of connection. And that's what we need to get away from, is who should be the center of it. And really, the individual, it should be the center. It should be the employees. They should be the center of it. And now let's figure out how to fund it.
Camille, do you have any comments on that? Or again, because we don't have much time left, it'd be great to hear what you think has to happen going forward, whether legislatively, culturally, to have defined benefit plans, perhaps even just maintain where they are now, maintain that 11%, and perhaps even be seen as an option to be considered.
Yeah, well, I mean, something has to change. And I know we've had a lot of fun and we've laughed during the session, but I mean, we are in a retirement crisis. This is incredibly serious, and they don't get better. Things just get more expensive, and down the road, society ends up bearing the cost. If a crisis is not fixed. And I'll say in Washington especially, we don't agree on a lot as Americans, but the National Institution for Retirement Security recently issued a report that shows retirement security and retirement crisis is something across all political parties. People care about it. People are united that something must be done. I mean, I think the number one thing has to be premiums. Unfortunately, it's out of PBGC's control, but even, talking to PBGC, talking to the Hill, making this an issue, making it so that people understand this is a real problem. I think without fixing this kind of awful premium structure that we're in right now, I don't have as much hope for DB, but I do, I appreciate the information about TikTok. I think rebranding, refreshing the system, that's, if the employees demand it, if you get enough people that are asking, where's my pension? Because normally when I hear where's my pension, it's someone who worked years ago and is looking for something. But, we need the younger workers to get behind this movement and start asking for things. Because as we've seen, I mean, Gen Z, they're an incredibly active generation. And, maybe now I'm intrigued, I need to look up some of these actuarial influencers, which I did not know was a thing. But I think, that has to change. And yeah. But also, considering some of these different designs, the risk-sharing designs, the variable annuity plans, PEPs for DB. I mean, we have to explore these options because right now the current system just does not work for our existing workforce. So just, some light, easy check-the-box activities, but it really takes, it takes this community, it takes all the employers, it takes PBGC, it takes everyone.
And I'll also add to that is I do think it takes people to rethink, because when we're looking at what the unions are asking for, this coming full circle, is they want in the fights with UAW and with Boeing, they want their traditional, benefit package to come back, and that's just not going to happen. So we have to bring in a broader community. That often what happens, you'll just have business talking here, the unions are over here, different groups over there, and until you get all of the groups to think differently, that they can keep pounding and pounding on it, but the employers, it wasn't working. But so let's ask for a different type of security, and the PEP or a variable annuity. But the unions, they won't even go there. We've seen some of them go there on the multi-employer side, but even with that, sometimes it's fighting tooth and nail, because it's like, if I can't have everything, then I don't want anything at all. And I think that's where we need to get rid of that mentality that this is not 1950, and even if it were, it really wasn't very good anyway. So let's try something different.
Great. Now, Tim, I'm going to give you a chance. Do you want a last word, or you want to end on Chantel's impassioned comments? So, yeah, so I want to thank the panel. It's been really fascinating and interesting, and I hope those in the audience have some new thoughts and ideas to think about, and feel free to share any comments with me in my role, because the Academy is trying to be part of these conversations on the Hill and with other stakeholders to keep positive change moving forward. So thank you so much for your attendance today.